Welcome to Plato's Pods. Today is March 14, 2021. This podcast is audio recording of a live meetup group. We meet through Toronto Philosophy Meetup, Calgary Philosophy Meetup, Online Rebels Meetup. I'm Ave Alice. I'll be coordinating this episode. I would like to pass the screen now and the microphone, of course, to James for today's discussion. James?
Well, thank you, Eva, and welcome everyone to our discussion today on Plato's Charmides. So the Charmides is not one of Plato's more widely known or widely quoted dialogues, but I think it has a particular resonance, I think, especially with the dialogues that we've discussed in our past few episodes, starting with the Timaeus. We had a few sessions on the Timaeus, and I think there's some themes from the Timaeus and then our discussion on the Meno 2 weeks ago that will follow through quite logically, I think, in this dialogue. And so in this dialogue, we're looking at the nature of science itself and connecting science to knowledge and trying to understand what is knowledge and what is not knowledge. So a very important dialogue, and one that I was very surprised to discover a number of things in this. So very much looking forward to our discussion today. Just before we launch into our discussion, I wanted to say, I think what we'll do next is Phaedrus. So in 2 weeks, we'll start with Phaedrus. And we'll do that in a couple of sessions. So I'll post the notice for that in a few days. We'll start with the first 20 or so pages of Phaedrus and then proceed to do the remainder of it in the following session. So that will be next up. And as always, for those participating here, if we're free to ask questions, make comments, make observations. We don't have to follow any set plan. I do have a few questions that I've designed today to keep the discussion flowing if we reach a point where we need to find a point to launch a discussion from. And the questions are designed to really kind of cover the majority of the material in the dialogue, but we don't have to stick to any set agenda, as I said. So it's always, what our participants feel like discussing, I think, is the important thing. And certainly Plato wouldn't want it any other way. I think it's the importance of dialogue is to make sure that we understand each other, learn from each other, and explore new ideas. And there's so many new ideas in here that we can't possibly do it all justice in 2 hours of discussion, but we'll do our best. So especially interested to see what everybody feels, what parts of this dialogue really resonated with you as well. And participants, if you would use the raise hands feature when you'd like to speak, and I will call on people sort of in the order that the hands are raised, and again, with preference to people who haven't spoken before. So without further ado, we'll start the discussion today. And what I thought we would do to start off with is look at a short, it's just under 3 minutes. It's a video clip, and it's a video clip by Brian Cox, who's a physicist. And Brian is somebody who I admire greatly for his philosophical approach to science. In fact, when Brian was in Toronto, I think it was 2 years ago, I went to see him, and he had a really engaging presentation. He talked about Einstein's theory of general relativity, which is a very complex theory, but he put it in a way that I think really related to the audience. And there was about 1,000 people in the audience. It was quite a large crowd. And so I think everybody was really following what he was saying and very engaged and interested. But near the end, Brian said, "And what is the meaning of this all?" And all of a sudden, the room erupted into applause as soon as he said the word meaning, because I think we're all sort of searching for meaning. And it was a powerful experience to be in that room with Brian, a very well-renowned and respected physicist whose interest in science really branches beyond physics into biology and chemistry. And in fact, this clip that we're just about to listen to is from his BBC series, The Wonders of Life. And so he does talk a lot about biology in this particular series. So let's just take a listen to this clip, because the question that Brian asks at the end of the clip, I thought was a really good place to maybe launch our discussion today, to launch our own dialogue today with the question that Brian asks at the very end of this clip of about 3 minutes. So if you would bear with us, Eva, if you would play the clip, that would be appreciated.
Tonight is November the 1st, and here in Sagada, in fact across the Philippines, that means that it's the Day of the Dead. That's the day when people come to this graveyard on a hillside and celebrate the lives of their relatives. The people light fires to honour and warm the departed, inviting their souls to commune with them. No matter how unscientific it sounds, this idea that there's some kind of soul or spirit or animating force that makes us what we are and that persists after our death is common. Virtually every culture, every religion has that deeply held belief. And there's a reason for that, because it feels right. I mean, just think about it. It's hard to accept that when you die, you will just stop existing, and that you are, your life, the essence of you is just really something that emerges from an inanimate bag of stuff.
Mamati ay wala na spirits da. Kanayon ay kakadwamimot lang. At siya din na amok ay kakadwamimot lang da ida isnan kagadinan ano ka kakalkalimi da ida ay silently.
Too close. You can see that these people feel not only that they're coming to celebrate the lives of their relatives, but they're coming in some sense to communicate with them. Their relatives, even though their physical bodies have died, are still in some sense here. And when you think about it, that's not so easy to dismiss. I mean, if we are to state that science can explain everything about us, then it's incumbent on science to answer the question, what is it that animates living things? What is the difference between a piece of rock that's carved into a gravestone and me?
Thank you. That's I just found that to be such a powerful question right at the end there. And so here we have Brian Cox, a scientist, asking what are the limits of science, I think. And he says that it's incumbent on science to explain. If science says that it can explain everything, it's incumbent on science to explain the difference between a physical object, which is the rock or the gravestone in that little video clip, and himself, which is not a physical object entirely. The self is more than a physical object. And we saw that in the Timaeus, we saw that in the Meno, we've seen that in the other dialogues that we've looked at, the Phaedo, that beautiful dialogue about the soul. And so in that video clip, Brian talks about soul as well. And so I just thought we could launch our discussion today on the Charmides, which talks about science with the question that Brian asked at the end, and maybe the related question, which is present in the dialogue, is knowledge of all knowledge, including of that which is not knowledge, logically possible. And I'm just wondering what our participants feel about that. What do you think about that question that Brian asked at the end of the video? Donald?
My hand went up not because of the end, but really because what Brian Cox said at the beginning, that it was a day on which the people were celebrating the lives of their relatives. Well, of course, in this dialogue, and maybe I'm sure this is not where you want to go, but in my study of Plato, it was where I was driven. In this dialogue, Plato doesn't really celebrate. Critias and Charmides are two of Plato's relatives. It's his uncle and his uncle's cousin. And he's far from celebrating their lives. In fact, he's showing that they're basically idiots that don't know how to control themselves or control others, and therefore should have avoided their role in the 30, the tyranny that took control of Athens at the end of the Peloponnesian War. So I thought at the beginning, when he opened with that line, that whoever selected this film was like so prescient. I mean, this, as you say, there's the end, but there's also this beginning that has a strong irony to it that I think also makes it a wonderful introduction to the Charmides. And that's enough from me.
Well, thank you. And yeah, I mean, certainly the question, that he asked at the beginning, and certainly this whole setting of being in a graveyard and celebrating the life, but also the memory of those who had passed before, I think is such an important idea that that Plato certainly develops. And the actual history that follows the characters Critias and Charmides. I mean, the Charmides is a character who really doesn't appear very much in the story, in the dialogue. Critias, I think, is the one that's doing more of the talking here. But certainly at the beginning of the dialogue, Critias presents a number of ideas about what temperance is. So temperance is one of the four virtues that Plato brought to us in the Republic. Temperance is one of the four virtues, and we can think of temperance as meaning self-control. And certainly there was maybe an absence of self-control in the tyranny that you mentioned, Donald, that actually put Socrates to death eventually, and we saw that when we talked about the Apology. But I guess the question is, what is the self that we're trying to control? If we're talking about self-control and temperance, which is the theme that the dialogue begins with, Critias puts forward 5 different propositions about temperance. And I'm just wondering too, what people think about these 5 different propositions that are put forward at the beginning. Are they logical? Are they propositions that maybe the way self-control is maybe sometimes defined not by ourselves, but by society that we live in? And so it's certainly an interesting theme to pick up on as well. So whether it's the question at the beginning or the idea at the beginning of the video that Brian presents, or the question at the end, I'm just wondering again, is knowledge of all knowledge, including what is not knowledge, logically possible? And this is a theme that, again, Socrates talked about in the Apology when he relates the story of what the oracle at Delphi said. It's a story that comes through his friend Chaerephon. And the oracle at Delphi said that Socrates was the smartest man alive, for he knew one thing, which is that he knew nothing. In fact, the quote from the Apology, this is Socrates talking. He says, "I am wiser than this man. It is likely that neither of us knows anything worthwhile, but he thinks he knows something when he does not. Whereas when I do not know, neither do I think I know, so I'm likely to be wiser than he to the small extent that I do not think I know what I do not know." And that was in Apology 21d. So again, this nature of knowledge and this idea of science as being, we have scientific method, we have ways of doing science. And so science is, I think, maybe we can talk about the definition of science, because that's throughout this dialogue. I mean, how do people perceive science? Is science the division of knowledge from what is not knowledge? So is science the word that we use for the dividing line between that which is knowledge and that which is not knowledge? What do people think about that? The idea of the definition of science, and what are you getting from this dialogue in terms of Plato's approach to that definition, or the questions that Plato wants us to consider in that definition? Any thoughts about that? If you have knowledge, for example, of something, does that mean you also know what is not knowledge? Is knowledge and not knowledge, are they equal and opposites? Certainly equal and opposites are a big theme that Plato plays on. We saw that in the Timaeus, for example, this idea of equal and opposites, and then combining the equal and opposites with some sort of bond, which he talked about in the creation of the universe in Timaeus. Any thoughts on that? So when J.K.
Yeah, well, science claims to know quite a bit because I think I heard a discussion with the scientist, a scientist was it, who says that, well, we we know 4% of what there is, and 96% is dark matter and dark energy. But we know, but since we know the laws of the 4%, then we can extrapolate that, about what the 96% is, even though it's not known. And but eventually we'll get there, so forth. But so that's kind of a science, makes these kind of leaps of knowledge. I don't know if it's self-confidence or, definitely not based on fact, the fact of what we can know. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you have a good example there, J.K., with the dark matter and the dark energy. So we use these words dark, or the scientists use the words dark. They know that dark energy and dark matter exists, but they don't really know what it is. They just know that it exists because they can detect it through its gravitational effect, for example. And they know that dark matter and dark energy actually comprise 95%, I think, of the universe, that the actual physical universe seems to be only 5%. And so there's this great proportion of the universe that is unknown. That makes me think of the theme that Plato sets in Timaeus 28a. I keep going back to Timaeus 28a because it's that distinction that he makes between that which always is and never becomes, and that which becomes and never is. And those two distinctions that he makes require, he says, a different level of understanding. So the realm of that which always is but never becomes requires a reason to count in order to understand it. And by contrast, that which becomes but never is requires the unreasoning senses to comprehend it. So there's that distinction. I think that's an important distinction, maybe in the pursuit of science, perhaps, is to understand the different types of knowledge, I guess, that we can apply to things. And so the example that you used, J.K., of dark matter and dark energy, I think is a very good example. I had a few other, kind of examples along that line. The idea of maybe distinguishing between knowledge that something is true or false. And again, you have that equal and opposite kind of, either something is true or it's false. And true and false are equal and opposites, right? So maybe distinction between knowledge that something is either true or false, and distinguishing it from knowledge of why something is true or false. And I'm just wondering if we can talk about a distinction between those two types of knowledge and maybe how that difference applies to science. So, for example, it's known that all atoms except hydrogen have a neutron in it. So hydrogen is the only element that doesn't have a neutron in it. Okay, so we know that is the case. But do we know why that's the case? Or is the question why something really of a different nature than the question of is it true or false, right? So that's kind of what I was getting towards with the question of whether it's possible to have knowledge of all knowledge, including of that which is not knowledge. Maybe another example is, that we know that it is a fact that the instant a collapsing star forges iron and the great pressure that's building up in the collapsing star, we know that the instant that it forges iron, and iron has 26 protons, 26 electrons, and 26 neutrons, that a supernova explosion occurs. We know that's a fact. But do we know why? Is the question why different from the question that? And I think maybe that's kind of maybe one of the themes that that Plato's trying to get us to explore, maybe with the Charmides. What do we think of the idea? There's a really compelling statement that Socrates makes, or I found it compelling, at 174a in the Charmides. And at 174a, Socrates asks us to imagine, quote, the sort of man who, in addition to the future, knows everything that has been and is now, and is ignorant of nothing. Of this man, I think you would say that there was no one living who was more scientific. And so maybe as we explore the definition of science, what do you think of that statement? Is that true? I mean, if a scientist were to discover knowledge of everything, say it's a grand unifying theory of physics, and certainly I think many scientists, including Albert Einstein, have searched all their lives for a grand unifying theory of everything. So, what if a scientist were to discover knowledge of everything, and so this person would know, would be ignorant of nothing, would know everything that exists in the present and everything that was going to happen in the future. So, first of all, is the question that, or is the statement that Socrates makes that of this man, I think you would say that there was no one living who was more scientific. Is that the way we define science? Knowledge of all facts? Just wondering what you think of that definition, and then maybe we can explore the idea of, well, what would such knowledge do to such a person? Imagine if you possessed that knowledge of everything that exists in the present and everything that will exist in the future. You are ignorant of nothing. Imagine what it would be like if you possessed that knowledge. Let's explore that definition of science, maybe. Is that how we define science? JK?
Yeah, if you were to know everything, and you you wouldn't really have any kind of free will, because since you could predict, or you know everything, there's no need for free will. You'd be like just supercomputer that is just totalitarian, takes over all of everything, including your free will. So I don't know if the sense of meaning must depend on one's free will, and the idea of unpredictability. So there's that one element of it, and it seems to that kind of known everything, past and future, means that you'd have to deny the fact of change and becoming. So it's Parmenides. It would be Parmenides' dream come true, and then you'd have Zeno being able to prove that there is no motion, and the paradox of not ever being able to get anywhere at all in space and time. So I don't know if if one could be happy about that kind of life, where we'd be stuck in a static universe, a static existence, and how that would affect one's emotional well-being.
Yeah, interesting comments that you make there. Certainly, in this idea of free will, or maybe I was thinking maybe the word agency, as you were saying that. Would you actually be an agent in your own life? Could you actually affect change if you were everything? Like, there was no change to be had because you knew everything that was going to happen. So what can you change when you know everything? And what would you feel if you were such a being that had discovered the secrets to the universe? If science had led you to the secrets of the universe, would you be happy, or is happiness something maybe that would escape you? A fascinating question. We have Moshe and then Joel. Moshe?
I'm very uncertain about the use of the term science. I think you raised that question yourself. Certainly, we've seen since the since the beginning of the modern philosophy, and maybe even a little bit before that, natural philosophy, as we used to call it, has peeled off into individual sciences, one after another. And the more things that we come across empirically, that we discover theoretically, and that we can go and pursue through some sort of empirical method, becomes a new science. You have, first you were studying, you studied biology, and then you studied the human body, and then you studied the genome, and then you found messenger RNA, and all of these become more and more specialized sciences. And in science, you don't know everything past and future. You have a useful model for making predictions and for providing a structure to test. And if it works, you keep that model. If it doesn't, you abandon it. So I don't think that I don't think that what they mean by science here is what we mean by science. Okay? And I was just trying to take a look in my Loeb translation of the Charmides, and if I remember correctly, Socrates was referring to knowledge, referring to science as knowledge, as opposed to doxa. And that being the case, if we do have knowledge of something, I think he's leading us down sort of a garden path here when he's suggesting that knowledge will be knowledge of all the past and all the future. I mean, I don't think he's Leibniz, where the monad, knows everything. So I think he's sort of teasing us here. He doesn't mean by science certainly what we mean by science, and I don't think that even in his time, true knowledge, as opposed to opinion, could give you knowledge of the future and the past.
Thank you. It's you raised a number of important points in what you said, and I just wanted to pick up on maybe two of those things before we go to Joel. And one thing you talked about was the branches of science, and so I'm seeing this picture of a tree, and one branch might be physics, one branch might be biology, another branch might be mathematics, but do all of the branches in the tree have to necessarily tie to a single root? And maybe that's one of the questions that I'm kind of seeing in my head as a picture from the words in this dialogue, is that individual branches of knowledge need to then tie to something for them to be considered knowledge. And so maybe that's one of the key questions about science and the definition of science. So this idea of the branches and the root of knowledge.
Can I add something to that?
Sure.
You have a great picture of a tree. Okay. I'm sorry, I'm not as graphically astute as I could be, but do you know what a banyan tree is?
Yeah.
It drops individual roots. Okay. So on that model of science as a tree, the branches, although they started with the original plant, dropped their own roots. And I'm suggesting that as an alternate metaphor, just to think of.
Yeah, well, thank you. No, and that's actually a very good point. I mean, the other point that you made was this discussion of empirical evidence, and so I would go back, to Timaeus 28a, where Plato made that distinction between understanding using sensory data, which would be maybe empirical evidence, and that understanding is applied to the realm that is becoming but never is, versus an understanding of the realm of that which is but never becomes, which requires a reasoned account. And so maybe in terms of our knowledge of science, when do we apply the reasoned account versus when do we apply the empirical evidence? So I just wanted to pick up on that point that you raised about empirical evidence, Moshe. So thank you very much. And then we'll go to Joel. Joel?
Hey, guys. So I'm trying to figure out which question I want to grab onto. But I remember a few questions that got brought up reminded me of a book I read last year by Sean Carroll, The Big Picture. And there was a really cool old thought experiment that he reminded me of. I believe it was called Laplace's Demon. And it went something along the lines of, like, imagine if there was an invisible demon that like had all the knowledge and power in the world and was like screwing with your existence, either making things horrible for you or better off. And if that demon existed, how would you know? How would you find out, so to speak? So that's a really really fun thought experiment to wrestle with. But I also want to tie that with what J.K. said too, with how does free will tie into the idea of having all unlimited knowledge, if you will. If you just had a theory for everything or a fact that fit into everything, I feel like it would essentially eliminate the idea of free will. Because if you had an answer to every question and you knew everything, and it all boiled down to a fact or a formula, I feel like you would be about as free as a calculator is free from mathematics. Like there wouldn't be a choice at that point. It would just be static, if you will. So, and then finally, James's question to what's the difference between knowledge versus non-knowledge? Isn't that the whole point of the scientific method, is to literally take an idea and to just discredit it, to try to disprove it, if you will. And if it holds up against scrutiny, if it makes predictions, then that becomes an empirical observation of reality, if you will. But I thought the whole point was to essentially, disprove any theory, if you will, going from a priori to a posterior. And that's my only take on it.
Okay. Well, thank you, Joel. And I love that line that you used, that you would be as free as a calculator is free of mathematics. I think that's a wonderful analogy that maybe demonstrates the constraints of full knowledge. But I think you also raised the point of this demon that could make us doubt, and it makes me think of Descartes' wonderful discourse on the method, and this idea is, there is a lot of doubt in the world, and if you know something, can you reduce that doubt down to the very point which the last thing that you cannot doubt is that you're having the thoughts? And so is there something that is not doubtable in this idea of understanding one's own soul, which maybe connects to the idea of the Charmides in terms of the idea that Socrates presents, that temperance or self-control is a science of self. And I wanted to get into that maybe in our discussion as well today. So thank you for those points. And then we'll go to Moishe and then Donald. Moishe?
There are two things. One, I want to remind us all of Dostoevsky's when he is talking in The Idiot about my most advantageous advantage, which is to do something completely contrary to what is either good for me, either good or good for me. Human beings are not calculators, even if they know everything. And if we want to go to the ancients, in terms of ethics, in the Nicomachean ethics, Aristotle and Plato or Socrates have divergent views of how good takes purchase on the individual. Because to Socrates, if you know what the right thing is to do, then you do the right thing. But on Aristotle's account, you have to complete the practical syllogism of knowing the right thing, being able to examine what your particular action is going to be now, and making the connection between the major and the minor premise. And he talks about the incontinent man as a person who knows what is the right thing to do in this particular situation, but cannot make that connection. So even though he knows everything, you can still do otherwise.
Well, thank you. It's and I'm thinking maybe there's a point here that we're making, that if you know something to be true, then do you also know that what is not true, which is the opposite of truth? Is knowing that something is, equal to knowing that something is not. And I'm wondering, there's I think maybe it was J.K. mentioned Zeno's paradoxes, and there's a passage at 168c in the Charmides, which is a great passage. And if there's anybody mathematically inclined in this group, I'd love to talk about that passage here. But it's this idea that, if you had all-encompassing knowledge, which would be knowledge not just of the individual branches, but of the root of all knowledge. There's that wonderful passage at 168c, where Socrates gets a little bit mathematical and says that anything that was the double of the other doubles and of itself, I suppose, be half of itself and of the other doubles, because I don't suppose there is a double of anything except a half. And so there's a really interesting kind of conversation there about, if you can divide knowledge into two continuously and then continuously double it, do you ever know what is not knowledge? You're always trapped in knowing what is knowledge, but do you know also what is not knowledge? And I'm wondering if that theme is what Plato is maybe picking up on those references to the oracle at Delphi and what the oracle said about Socrates. It's not just about knowing that something is, it's also knowing that something is not. So sorry, I've talked a little bit longer than I intended on that one, but we'll go to Donald. Donald?
I think in the Charmides, there's this knowing and not knowing or whatever. But as you hinted at the beginning of your remarks, knowledge, while we would say it's good in itself, Socrates certainly here is pushing that there is also the use. This knowledge is to make us happy. It is to let us choose wisely, or whatever term we want to do that. It is not just to know how the universe works or something like that. In fact, while not here, I think from what you've said, we'll take up where Socrates turns away from natural philosophy and said he's only interested in things that affect his ethical life, his ability to do good, to do something. And he tends to talk about like the science of medicine. It's not that it's interesting because it teaches us knowledge of the body. It brings us health, something that we experience in our own lives as a good. And to tell you, I get kind of lost in a lot of these syllogisms, but I think this theme that knowledge is not just knowing for the sake of knowing comes across pretty clear. That temperance is, if it's a knowledge, it's a knowledge of how to pick and choose and use other types of knowledge to make better pots, to make healthier people, to choose wisely.
Thank you. I really like the way you put that, this idea of picking and choosing knowledge, because there's so many different pieces of knowledge that we have, especially now in what we call the information age that we live in. We're surrounded by knowledge or discrete sets of facts, but how do we pick and choose which facts are best for us? That wonderful use or reference you made to health, which Socrates talks about in this dialogue. He talks about it in a lot of dialogues, this idea of understanding health. What is actually healthy, and when you have all of different facts that you can choose from, which facts are going to make you the healthiest, both in your own, in your mind as well as in your body, which are really, part of a combined mechanism that makes up you. And so, yeah, and I just, the other point that you raised, was this idea of good. And so just before we go to JK, I just wanted to read a little piece from 174C of the Charmides. It really picks up on the question that Brian Cox asked in that opening video that we looked at, but also the question that Socrates, or this imagination that Socrates presents of the perfectly scientific person who would know everything. And at 174C, Socrates says that maybe it would be discovered that it was not living scientifically that was making us fare well and be happy, even if we possessed all the sciences put together, but that we have to have this one science of good and evil. And so you can possess all of the knowledge in the universe, Socrates is saying, but maybe the thing that really makes us happy is to understand what divides good from evil. And I found that a very powerful statement. So I just wanted to bring that in because you mentioned good, and I thought that was a very good way to relate that particular passage. So I'll just go to JK at this point. JK?
Yeah, so what I think is being pointed out is that there's a conflict between knowledge and the will. What makes us really happy may not just depend on knowledge. We have, there's been a tendency to rely on our reason our reason, which is how we understand how to do things, which is the foundation of our knowledge, to decide what is good and what is evil, and that conflicts with maybe the will, which is not which is does not always depend on knowledge for for the individual's happiness. That somehow the will has to has its own way of finding its own happiness. So maybe there's something there about someone mentioned Dostoevsky and so forth, and that it doesn't matter what how much you know or what you know to be good, but you could just go, just the will can just decide to go against that. And so there's something, there's the will that may be the arbiter of what what is good and evil.
Interesting, and I think you used the word reason in there as well, and it just makes me think that the will maybe relies on an account of the reasons why. So that reasoned account that Plato talks about again at Timaeus 28a, you need to use a reasoned account, it's said, in order to understand the eternal state of that which is but never becomes. And so, I think that's an important part, again, that I just have this picture of this perfect being who knows everything. And that perfect being is surrounded by others like me who have imperfections. I'll be the first to admit to my imperfections. Would a perfect being who has perfect knowledge, there's nothing that this perfect being doesn't know, would this perfect being be happy surrounded by imperfect beings such as me? I don't know. I don't see happiness in that. And so, but I find the statement that Socrates makes about this knowledge of good and evil to be kind of rather profound. We'll go, I see JK, you have your hand up again. Let's just go back to Donald, and then we'll go back to JK. Donald?
Well, from what I read in the Charmides, the science of good and evil is not necessarily some knowledge of something external. It starts, Socrates kind of glances off of know thyself. It's the knowledge of what's beneficial to us, and we might say redundantly, what's truly beneficial to us, that allows us to make those judgments as to what is good and evil. In this sense, I always feel like there's so much in Plato of the ideas, but when I talk like this, it's like I want to make him an existentialist or something like that. that we're not born with some rational knowledge of human nature. Human nature is something that becomes in the world. It's not one of those ises. It's one of those things that always becomes, and that we have to learn. That means through another trite phrase, the examined life, not the examining life, not the going around and annoying other people, but having other people perhaps annoy us and helping us examine our life to learn human nature so that we can use knowledge to provide benefit. I mean, we're not worried about, in a sense, providing benefit to rocks and rivers and things in the natural world. We're just talking about, when we're talking ethically, we're largely just talking about ourselves. And you know, I think in a way here, Socrates is sort of taunting Critias and Charmides that they've heard these discussions and they want to present them, but they don't understand the internal logic that holds them together because they haven't done the know thyself, the examined life, and therefore have no knowledge of benefit and then no knowledge of good and evil. And they just wander around somewhat unenlightened. That's way too much talking.
No, not at all. You raised so many good points there that you know, I wanted to just pick up on them. We've got a good speakers list. We've got JK, Jane, and then Moisha. But just before we go to JK and then to Jane, you said, Donald, you know, that this idea between this distinction you made between internal logic and external references, and I just wanted to point out, you know, at the beginning of the Charmides, Critias presents 5 different propositions on what temperance or self-control is. And he starts kind of with external references, you know, temperance is being quiet, you know, because you don't want to bother other people. And, you know, so that's kind of this reference of yourself to the other people that you would be bothering if you weren't quiet. And so Socrates takes him through those different propositions and explores them and realizes that they don't apply in all cases. And so Critias arrives at his 5th proposition at 164D about temperance as follows, in quote, "As a matter of fact, this is pretty much what I say temperance is, to know oneself." And I agree with the inscription to this effect set up at Delphi. So again, that reference to what the oracle said about Socrates and not knowing not just what you know, but what you don't know. And so, Donald, you raised also the point of knowing self. And I just wondered what people think about whether self is a fixed quantity over time or is self something that is always becoming. I like the way that you said that. So, and that's the point, a very important point I think that we should explore in this. And the idea that you talked about, you know, this idea of the unexamined life is not worth living, which is a very important statement that Plato makes elsewhere. So a number of very key points that you raised here. So let's explore those and any other thoughts that people have. So we'll go to JK and then to Jane and then Moisha. JK?
Yeah, I want to pick up on that idea, that Donald's idea of becoming and the unexamined life. So maybe it's the idea of examining life, because our lives are always becoming, changing. And it's the reason why, you know, some great philosophers like Hegel and Freud posited the death, you know, drive, or the thanatos, the death instinct, and it really, death doesn't mean a total end of life, but it's a process that occurs in every aspect of life because we're always changing. Every time you wash your hands, you're shedding dead skin and so forth. But just think of a growth of a baby, so forth, and baby's always changing, and as the baby grows into adult, he's shedding his the life of his youth, and just like any plant that grows from a bud, the bud is left behind as being dead in order for it to flower, or the caterpillar, becoming a butterfly and the caterpillar dies in order for the butterfly to emerge. So the idea of the death instinct, I think, is very important in the whole understanding of our life as a becoming, and not as just a being. We become beings that constantly become. So I kind of like that idea of becoming, and tied in with the really kind of like morbid sounding idea of the death instinct, or thanatos, the Greeks had, because without one you can't have the other, right? So knowledge is sometimes stuck in these paradigms of self-understanding, and these paradigms change, right, with each period of scientific understanding. And so I like that idea of one paradigm dies in order for another paradigm to emerge, and leading to our better understanding of ourselves. But it's never static. If it becomes static, it becomes a dogma, a doxa.
Interesting. You raised a number of good points there. Certainly this idea, without death there wouldn't be any becoming, and it makes me again think about that. Maybe that poor unfortunate scientist who discovers everything and becomes, this being with perfect knowledge. Then is there any more becoming at that point? And then for the rest of us, is this idea of self something that's always changing, or is self something that's kind of fixed at birth and you're kind of stuck with yourself for your life? That's I think an important point that would be worth exploring here. And as you put it at the end, does the paradigm always change? Is the paradigm of self fixed? And this idea that's presented in Charmides as temperance being the science of self. Where do we explore the science of self? Where is the science of self in schools today? Anyway, we'll go from here to Jane. Jane, welcome.
Hi everyone. I'm going to try to be as concise as possible. Don't know if that's going to happen or not. But first point is this idea has been mentioned a couple of times, that having sort of this ultimate knowledge of everything, the past, the present, the future, would mean that there is no free will. So doesn't that basically lead us to the thought that the sort of the conception of free will is erroneous, because it only means that we are missing and lacking of certain kinds of knowledge? And if we were ever to find that knowledge, then we would realize that there is no such thing as free will. And from that, if we go to the dichotomy of order and chaos, I guess ultimate knowledge, if it can be termed that way, is sort of ultimate order, and it's chaos that gives us this variability and this erroneous conception of free will. To continue, second point about the self, I was just thinking about what JK was saying, and it seemed to me that if we're using the logic in this dialogue and in other dialogues about the same and the other, that which is becoming and that which is, it seems the person, while he's alive, he's always becoming. And for like a regular person, the state of being is actually the state of death. You cannot be becoming in death. You just are. and then you have this very short lifespan in the course of which you are always becoming, as JK mentioned, you're always sort of changing or shedding, developing, or whatever, and then you reach this certain point when you stop becoming and you just always are. And this would lead me to the next point of it's not possible, according to the logic that we see in the dialogues, it's not possible for like a mortal person to gain that type of knowledge, because from what I understood in the Timaeus, the self could be considered as the soul, and the soul is that which sort of binds the idea, which is the eternal, the is, and what is becoming, what is always changing. So sort of like the shadow of the ideas of Plato. And so the self, it can kind of reach out to get some of that, a piece of that, I guess, ultimate knowledge, but we can never really get it while we're mortal. At least that's the sort of logic that I see in what Socrates is saying. And to answer the question of happiness and can we get it through knowledge, I mean, it would seem that if science could give us happiness, then the smarter, so the more knowledgeable a person is, the happier they would be. But this is, I'm not sure if there's like a correlation, if there's like any studies that show a correlation, but based on what I've seen, that's not the case. You can know a lot, but still be a very unhappy person, and the opposite is true. And then we have things that make us happy, and or that should make us happy, but they don't. And why is that? That, I guess, that sort of bounces back to what James mentioned of like, we understand that something happens, but we don't know why exactly that is. That's it. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And you touched on the idea of death, and death as a state of maybe eternal is. So it's not a state of becoming anymore, but it kind of enters the state that always is and no longer becomes. And it made me think of that opening scene of the Brian Cox video that we saw at the beginning of this episode, where he points out that even though those people, that the people in the Philippines went to see their ancestors, even though they're no longer physically living, their souls, or their memories of their souls, have this continuing effect on these people. It's brought them out to the cemetery, it's brought them out to celebrate those memories. And so maybe even though we call it death physically, it's not death in terms of memory, and so the soul, continues to exist in the realm that is but never becomes. The physical realm is the realm that is always becoming, but the realm that is no longer becomes. But the realm that is, could encompass those who have died physically. So it's I think that's an interesting distinction that you made, and you also talked about the state of variability that we exist in while we're living. This variability of the self, and so maybe a reason why temperance, which is one of the prime subjects of this dialogue, is necessary. This idea of self-control, and what is it that we're controlling when we're trying to control the self? We'll go to Moishe and Joel. Moishe?
Okay. This dialogue we're having is certainly heady. I take it that when you read read the Charmides from the beginning to the end, we find out that we do not have, we cannot define the science of temperance. We go through a bunch of arguments for what temperance is and what temperance isn't, and at the end, Socrates says, "Well, we've discussed all this, but we still don't know what it is." That being said, Socrates is regarded to have always made good decisions. If you take a look at the Apology, he's going to be murdered by the state because the state has rightfully convicted him of a crime. And he's made these decisions not because he knew what to do, but because he admittedly doesn't know what to do, but he has a dam on that always stops him in the end, starts him in the right direction. And he can't quite explain this. He can't quite put this into words, but he says several times in different dialogues that he has this dam on that, that gets him to go into the right directions. So I think that the idea of a science of temperance is impossible. That's number one. The second thing is knowing yourself. Well, you raised the question, James, what is the self? And the self that can be known is not our private emotions or thoughts, but it is our actions. And it is understanding our actions that enables us to live in the present, to live in the Dorian mode. If you remember in the Laches, Nicias was saying, that a good soldier he has he stands his ground in battle, and when he introduces Socrates to the other people, he says, "You should have seen Socrates in the retreat from Delium." Okay, well, if standing your ground is the same thing as retreating, there's an impossibility there. So he doesn't know himself. His soul is not in the Dorian mode where his words and his actions are the same. So what we're going to know of ourselves has to be in our actions and in our understanding that our words, which we can examine, are commensurate, are the same. Okay. The third thing is that the third thing is death is not an eternal is. Death is an eternal not. When there's death, there's nothing. And independent of any philosophical or theological arguments or discussions about souls and eternal life and living before, having knowledge before your birth, which you recollect in life under the proper circumstances, there's no evidence of this. And to the extent that we can make speculative arguments about this, that's all interesting and fine and good, but we can't say that death is anything else but non-being. So those are my three highlights.
Thank you. And you touched on the idea of, or the question, when you said that the discussion is heady. Let's take it into a practical direction as well. There's no reason to keep the discussion on a theoretical level. I think maybe, practically speaking, how does any one of us exercise self-control? How does any one of us gain knowledge of self? And then practically speaking, how does the scientific world exercise temperance in their pursuit of knowledge and in their use of knowledge? And I think it's a very important question that, we can't just leave in the realm of thought, in the realm of philosophical thought, as important as it is. We're at a point technologically in our advancement where I think we do need to start thinking about how to apply this idea of temperance practically. And I've said before, quantum computing is an area that I follow quite a bit, both in terms of the physics and mathematics of it, but also in the philosophy of it. And there's great power, tremendous power that is just around the corner in quantum computing. But, I think some measure of control will be required with it. And I think a measure of self-control, especially for those developing the technology and the algorithms, will be very important. And so I think it's a very timely discussion. That's why this dialogue struck me as so key, at this particular point in time. And so let's explore the practicalities of temperance as well. And that question again is, when there's death, is there nothing? I'm interested in hearing what everybody thinks about that. Certainly in the opening scene where Brian Cox had, took the camera to the cemetery, there was memory. I'm seeing memory in that. So maybe there's nothing physical, but there's something that's maybe, just using in the broadest sense of the word metaphysical. So what do people think about that? So let's go to Joel and then JK. Joel?
So I'm going to take there were two topics that were brought up on the idea of the self, and I recall there was also the question of good and evil. So I want to take a very ambitious approach and actually tackle those for a second here. And before I jump into it, I want to state obviously that this is every definition I'm going to try to give is going to be an incomplete answer, but it's a personal answer that I too am trying to make sense of. So by all means, I'm open to be challenged and corrected on this if I step out of line here. But I really, when it comes to questions of like, say, good and evil, for example, dare I say that's not maybe a scientific question. That is obviously an ethical question. It's a human question. The idea of good, I like to think, is how we talked about a lot today, is the idea of knowledge and to know thyself and to live in harmony with that, to accept that and live within your means and to carry on through that forever progressive journey of knowing more and and complementing that process, if you will. So that still, again, that's a very sort of incomplete definition. And what I also like when people talk about evil, I always come back to a definition or a quote by Einstein saying, he said he thinks there's only two things in this world that are infinite, either the universe or human stupidity, ignorance, if you will. So I like to think that what is evil is the lack of knowledge, or not only just ignorance, but to know what you're doing it doesn't make any sense. I know, say, for example, this is going to hurt an innocent person, and I have every reason not to do it, but I'm going to do it anyway. So I like to think what is just simply evil is to have the awareness or the knowledge to do so or not to do so, but do it anyway. So that's number one. And number two, this idea of the self, it's such a fun paradox when I think about it. It's like when you really sit down alone and have a very intimate, you pose that challenge to yourself, saying, what am I exactly? It's like the idea of the self or I or the ego. It's very much like the shadow in the room that follows you everywhere, wherever you go. But whenever you actually stop and try to grab onto it or turn the light on, it disappears. I feel like that's what reflecting on the idea of I is, right? So I'm not quite sure what, like, if I were to describe James in one word or in a sentence, it's like you can't, or yourself, it's like every time you try to put a pin on it, it always feels incomplete, and that never stops, if you will. So I think maybe like when it's all over, and the question that was asked earlier about death is when you die, that's it. That inner dialogue of constantly trying to define what you are ends. But yeah, like I feel like that there's still parts of you that will live on forever in matter, through your family, through genetics. It's just that inner dialogue of constantly trying to define that very awkward sort of a very short-lived experience of just trying to figure out what you are, but you just dissolve into everything else. But maybe it's a paradox. There is no such thing as I. So I'm done.
Wow, you really really just kind of hit the mark on what I was thinking about quantum computing. This problem in physics that we have with what's called the observer effect. So as soon as you observe the scattering of photons, the scattering changes. So the act of observation actually changes the distribution of photons, and that's the famous double slit experiment that physicists still don't understand the reason why that happens. But you put it in such a great analogy that as soon as you reflect on the nature of I, it changes. So it's this constantly, it is almost like that Zeno's paradox of that constantly changing. I'm thinking of it as almost like fractional dimensions of yourself. Every time you think of yourself, it creates another new fractional dimension of yourself. And so it's constantly getting away from you. I love that analogy that you used. And then you also mentioned the word incompleteness. And in the notes for the session that I posted on the shared drive, I did mention Gödel's incompleteness theorem or theorems. And it's something that I think we saw in the geometry of the Meno when we looked at the Meno last time, and the geometry that Socrates takes Meno's attendant through. Kind of that diagonal argument process. And so again, if there's anybody that's really interested in mathematics in this group, I'd be happy to discuss that in greater detail. But thank you. You really just you hit on some points that I think are absolutely essential. And that question that you asked at the end, is I really something that exists? So we'll go to JK. JK?
Yeah, I'd like to dwell on that point of the self, because we usually think of ourselves as a singularity, but then once you think about yourself as singularity, you realize that that you're determined to have singularity, and that leads to the idea that we're not just a singularity, but we're part of a collective, and so we're also determined by what came before us, the idea of Plato's idea of recollection. So we are, a composite of so many other, dimensions of the world and of existence that, do we really have free will? You kind of like, think of, well, if we're so much determined by all these forces, inside, within us, and outside of us, do we really have free will? Maybe we don't. We're just destined to be whatever we're destined to be. And so the self would be something that is part of the whole, and the whole would be, our, maybe existential being, which is constantly in a state of flux, and that we're constantly changing. And even after death, the ultimate death, we don't know what comes after that. Is it being or a continuous state of becoming? So I don't know. Nietzsche had the idea of eternal return of the same. Probably not, because becoming is what Heraclitus said. We cannot step into the same river twice, so it has to be something different. So maybe it's the eternal return of difference. So I think the whole idea of the self is really in flux and in a state of change. So I don't know. So so when you come to examining your life, you're never reach a point of having to examine life, but you're examining constantly what that is, and it's never complete, which is what you just James and Joe was just mentioned.
What you said, JK, about same and different, it really again makes me think of Timaeus, where the creator mixes the same and the different and applies this bond to it. And I think this bond maybe is the soul that Plato keeps talking about and exploring in Phaedo and elsewhere, and it appears in almost all the dialogues, right? So this idea of this blending of same and different, and I think that's such a powerful idea that we have the capacity to be same or different. And so maybe that's the free will, is our choice between being same and different. what do people think about that idea? We've talked about free will a number of times here. Is our choice, to be the same or to be different? And is that a powerful choice? And again, not to forget the practicalities of all of this. Words are words, but we're at a point in time where we are developing tremendous technology, and to quote the philosophical Stan Lee, with tremendous power comes tremendous responsibility. And so where does this tremendous responsibility, how is it exercised? We can read words of a philosopher and geometer, Plato, who's been dead for maybe 2,400 years. And that's all fine and well, but how do we apply these words in practice in today's world? If we think that temperance is science of self, how do we apply the science of self, and how do the scientists apply the science of self? And maybe I'll just ask the question in terms of, the scientists who are developing quantum algorithms. How do they decide what is a good algorithm and what's an evil algorithm? Is that a question that we need to explore, as we go back to this idea of distinction between good and evil? I'll take it to Moishe at this point. Moishe?
Okay, James, to address your point about good algorithms or evil algorithms, when a scientist or a coder is writing code or solving a problem, I don't believe that they're looking for they're certainly not looking for either good or evil. They're looking for something that solves the problem that they are trying to address. And from a practical standpoint, that leads to all sorts practical, meaning sociologically, culturally, that leads to a lot of problems. Because we can do something in science, it doesn't mean that the science has led us in the right direction. Okay. The tremendous work that has been done in the United States and around the world on atomic radiation, built the bomb, and it's changed the world. That science, which when it was being pursued, for pure research purposes, was heady and exciting. Who knew what would happen to it after the politicians got a hold of it and decided, oh, well, we can release this force and it'll kill a whole ton of people. So I don't think that there's such a thing as a good algorithm or a bad algorithm. There's just a practical algorithm that is going to solve either solve or not solve the problem at hand. About this death, again, death and life are contraries. If we put a logical spin on that, I would like to talk about death as not life. And if life is becoming, death is not becoming anymore, but it's not is. It's not live. It's not life. It's not life. I mean, it's not life. It's not life. And it's like deep from our, when I see a dog dead in the street, or another human being is dead, and I realize that that their brief light has gone out, and they're dead. There's no thoughts there. And addressing your idea earlier, I missed the film at the beginning, but you mentioned several times that in the Cox film, you've talked about memory being present. In Mexico, they have a Dia de los Muertos, which is close to Halloween, and the families go out and decorate the tombs, and they bring the persons their favorite food, their favorite liquor, and flowers and things like that. And cities are all lit up, and there are great celebrations about it. But those memories are the memories of the living. The dead don't have any memories. The dead are not living, and only living creatures have memories. So I just want to point out what I take to be an equivocation on the idea of memory, because it applies certainly to the people who are living, but not to the non-living. And I also want to point out this thing about the examined life, or at least my take on it. Socrates, says, and the Oracle says, that the examined life is not worth living. But it doesn't follow from the fact that you have examined your life that you're living a good life. You could be a perfectly miserable person and examine your life. In fact, you could be a completely wicked person and examine your life. And being a wicked person and having an examined life, Socrates would probably be forced to say, although I don't understand how that's possible, you're right. An examined life doesn't lead to a moral life or a virtuous life.
That's certainly an interesting point, and the the point that you made about the Day of the Dead in Mexico, I think is very similar to what they were celebrating in the Philippines in the Brian Cox video. And this idea that while the dead don't appear to have any memory, or at least any memories that we can see, the idea is that the memories of the dead affect the actions of the living. So I think that was the point that Brian was making. Certainly the point that you made, Moshe, in terms of, there is an obvious difference between death and life. The difference is obvious. And I think it's something worth understanding. Yes, I mean, that certainly seems to be the case. It's an interesting, the title of that Brian Cox episode, it was from his Wonders of Life series, and the actual title is What is Life? So if we know that death is not life, then maybe the question is, what is life? And then maybe we get into this paradoxical kind of infinitely recursive question. So it's interesting to explore that. So thank you for those comments. And I just wanted to recall, Joel mentioned Einstein and the quote of Einstein's. There's a quote of Einstein's that I used in the posting for this meetup, and I just wanted to recall everybody about it, or remind people of it, because it really does relate, I think, to the idea that knowing that something is also maybe necessarily requires knowing what it is not. And so that quote of Einstein that's posted on the notice for the session, Einstein says, "As our circle of knowledge expands, so does the circumference of darkness surrounding it." So as the circle of knowledge expands, so does the circumference of that which is not knowledge surrounding it. And I thought that was very relevant to what was being said in this dialogue. So I just wanted to remind people of that. We'll go to Jane and then to Donald. Jane?
Just a couple of notes on what was said a little earlier about the same and the other. I think, and when reading the Timaeus, I sort of saw a beginning of like the dialectical conception being put into the same and to the other, and it being fused by the essence. And even a person, we can't really choose to be the same and the other, because we are always in a way the same and the other. Like, for example, we're having this dialogue, and then the kind of person we were before and the kind of person that we're going to be after, I would say that you're going to change a little bit, right? You have this exchange of ideas, and in a sense, you're going to be a little bit different than the way that you were just like 2 hours before. And this goes for anything that we do in life. We are the same, but we are always becoming the other, because we're getting these new experiences, new thoughts, doing, I don't know, new actions or whatever. And we're sort of always becoming the other. So we are always sort of the other. We're always becoming, but we still have the self the same in us. And a second thing I wanted to mention about temperance in science. I'm from the soft sciences, so so I'm not really good with like all the strict terminology or whatever. But I've spoken to a few people who work with machine learning, and from what I've heard from their experience and from the few articles that I've read, it seems like there's definitely no temperance or very, very small amount of temperance being practiced in machine learning, because basically they create like algorithms that live a life of their own, and basically it's very hard to control what's going on. And if some sort of issue pops up, it's very hard to figure out why this or that happened. And in terms of like practicality, I think this happened with the brand of cars by Toyota. They made these autopilot cars, and they ended up crashing. So they would get into accidents, and they basically took like a group of specialists to like look through all the information that there is and figure out why this happened. And it took like 6 or 8 months for them to just say, well, there's like practically like 100 different things that could have gone wrong, and so that's that, and they just had to like scrap the cars, and that's it. So, and I think this says a lot about where we're going with like our scientific approach, I guess, as humans in general. And if this is happening on very small and simple, relatively simple things, I'm even kind of scared to think what's going on the higher, more complex levels. That's all I wanted to mention. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the point about the Toyota, it reminds me of an article I read in the Atlantic some years ago, and I think that might have been about the sticking accelerators that they had in the Toyota Corollas, and I think that was about maybe a dozen years ago, where it turned out that in the Toyota Corolla at the time there was like 100 million lines of software code, 100 million lines that had built up over the Corolla's product life, which was something like 30 years at that point. The car has been around for a long time, and every time they make a change, they add some new code to the existing code, and so it wound up like at that point there was 100 million lines of software code, and the article was making the point that it was really beyond the capacity of any individual engineer or even a collective of engineers to understand what exactly all of this code was doing. So they just put the car on the road, they tested it, and if it behaved like they thought it should, then they said, oh, it was okay. But there's a point in a really interesting book that I read by computer scientist Hector Levesque, called, sorry, I've just forgotten the title, the Turing Test and the Quest for Real Knowledge, I think is part of the title, and I apologize, I've forgotten about it. But Hector makes the point in the book that the things that we don't expect actually occur more often than we plan. So the unexpected actually occurs more often than expected. And so that was maybe a good example of that. And certainly as we are developing quantum algorithms now, and we know that quantum physics involves entanglement, so that one thing that's done somewhere, one action that's done somewhere will have a reaction somewhere else, and that's a guarantee of the universal properties of quantum physics. So a very important point to understand in terms of quantum algorithms is, where do we understand the limits to our own knowledge to be? And do we really appreciate that which we don't know? And I think that's a point that is really coming through very powerfully in this dialogue, at least to my reading. So thank you for that. Donald.
Trying to make sure I'm not muting myself.
Yeah.
One of the things that an old professor of mine in a Plato seminar said, that Plato and Socrates, when they talk about sciences, it invariably leads back to medicine. And they have a particular fondness for medicine because it's normative. It has the concept of good health. Physics doesn't have like a concept of the universe is right ordered or it's disordered or something. They lack this normative. And I think that's something that's kind of important to notice, that you're not just, well, why is he always picking medicine? Well, because it has this concept, this normative concept of good health. And that's different. And we've seen in the conversation here today, or heard, that modern sciences, as a rule, lack this normative core. And two, I think, I don't know, Moishe, but I think I have to defend somewhat how examination of one's life leads to virtue. At least how unexamination of one's life leads perhaps to unvirtue. That we have to have some self-knowledge to know whether the actions we're going to take harm us or hurt us in ourselves. And it's there we also get the insight into what our actions might do to others. You know, we don't this knowledge, we don't find it under a rock, or it's not written on we open a notebook and there it is. Here's what selves are, or human beings are. We have to learn that through our own living. And this examination process is what provides us both the knowledge of ourselves and of others to act in ways that are truly beneficial. In another Platonic dialogue, I think there's an example of a wrestler who's so powerful he can do whatever he wants. And the argument quickly runs amok, because having this power to do anything doesn't get this wrestler anywhere, because he doesn't know how to direct it. And so he's as likely to use it for good or for evil or for benefit or for harm, however, whatever duality you want to use there. And it's this what the examination. And I don't know how we get that knowledge other than from us. We're both the observer and the observed, you know. And if we weren't self-conscious, I'm convinced there wouldn't be any ethics. There wouldn't be any discussions like this. We wouldn't wonder about what Socrates and Plato and were trying to teach us, because it wouldn't make any difference. We couldn't know our own nature. And therefore, our choices would either be pre-programmed in our genetics or some random choice or something, but they wouldn't be ethical.
That was a powerful comment that you made, Donald, you know, that we are both observer and observed. And it really makes me recall what Joel said, you know, about the instant you try to think about what I is, I changes. Right. So once you start to observe yourself, you change. Right. And so it's maybe like this quantum observer effect that we've got some, you know, continually evolving state, you know, and that what we do, we don't exist in a bubble. Anything we do affects somebody else some way, you know, even whether we're still alive or not, we still are affecting other people. And so, you know, how do we judge our effect on others? Very important question. So thank you. And Moishe.
Donald, thank you very much for the response. I apologize for nitpicking, but I'm a nitpicker. At Delphi are two inscriptions. One is examine life, and the other one is avoid excess. And while examining your life and avoiding excess are what's at Delphi, Plato has changed that. He makes a minor modification in it. And his modification is that an unexamined life is not a valuable life, is not worth living. Okay. He's not saying that an examined life is a virtuous life. He's just saying that it's not a valuable life. So I want to point out, you know, the difference between what's being said at Delphi, which is to curb your arete toward kleos, your drive toward glory, with by examining your life. But Plato's twisted it, and I think it's only fair to Plato for us to point out that the value that a human being should have in his life comes from the examination of that life, but it doesn't follow from that he's a virtuous person, that he's a temperate person. And the other thing is, and so I thank you very much for that. The other thing that I want to go back to is this thing that J.K. has brought up and James has brought up about free will and knowledge. If you had a person who knew everything, okay, I'm trying to understand how, let's say that super knowledge, how I could deduce out of that that James and Donald and JK and all of you people would be dialoguing with me today. I mean, how do you make that deduction? Because if in fact that kind of thing were true, then we should be able to make the deduction how I didn't freely choose to come to this lecture, but somehow James was determined to bring this lecture to me. And if someone can make an attempt at clarifying that, I will be your acolyte.
Wow, thank you. What a great question. It's and what a great thought that brings to mind. It's a great question. I'm going to think about that more. And really, I learned so much in these dialogues. And that question was a great piece of learning. And what was said before, I think it was Donald that you said medicine is normative. I hadn't thought of that before, but I keep reading Plato's dialogues and I keep seeing he brings in this idea of medicine. And I was trying to think, what is the connection? Obviously, but maybe as you say, it is that idea that it is fundamentally good, and that becomes the analogy that we reference good to, at least in the physical realm. So very important and powerful thought there. So again, a great point about dialogues is that we all learn from each other. I'm learning from this. I'm not the same person now that I was when we started this dialogue, which was an hour and 45 minutes ago, roughly. So I noticed the time is passing. We've got about 15 minutes left, and it's a great conversation as always. And so let's keep it going, and let's pick up on some of these themes. JK, I have you next.
Yeah, I think that the notion of an unexamined life and the difference between that and the idea that ignorance is bliss. I think that's what the point that Plato's point is, that examining life means that you understand some of the determinative forces, in your life that come from without and within. And so if you were to ignore that, you would be just at the whim of all those forces that you don't understand. And you would be just like the other animals in nature. They have instincts to do whatever they're destined to do. But in examining one's life, I think you do derive a sense of self-determination, right? Rather than to be just determined, and that the whole idea of self-consciousness and the idea of self as a conscious being is the point here that the examined life, is not worth living. I think it's maybe it's a little bit extreme, in that kind of indictment of people who are living happy lives and not caring about. But it's like the algorithms that are being produced that automatically learn. They don't understand how they develop those algorithms or how they operate, but they are able to develop them for self-learning. And but whether they can control where that leads to, is another question. And because I suppose that those kind of algorithms are not don't have to do or do not have capacity for self-examination. I'm not sure, but if they did, then it might be a good thing, right? So I know. Thank you.
Interesting thought. Would the algorithms have the capacity of self-examination? And certainly, I think the algorithms are programmed by humans, and to the extent that they're programmed by humans with imperfections who do not have perfect knowledge, then presumably the algorithms will embed paths for error. And so maybe that's something that we need to really understand. And it does become a question maybe of temperance in those who are programming the algorithms to really understand. You said, JK, an interesting point that just made me think of an answer maybe to that question about why everybody is here on this particular morning, participating in this particular session. Is it because I use some strange cosmic power to compel you all to be here? Or is it maybe because in the process of your own self-examination, you saw some value in this session when you saw the meetup posting there? Is it maybe in some sort of self-examination process that you thought, well, maybe I would get something out of this and I'll spend my time. I have many ways I can spend my time, but I'll spend my time doing this. So an interesting, maybe it just occurred to me that's maybe an answer to that question. And I don't know what others think. I love that question. What is it that brings you here? So I don't know if there's any other thoughts on that particular answer. The other point that I wanted to bring up, and I'm not sure we've really touched on it as much as we could. We can obviously, this discussion can carry on for a long time without any definitive conclusions, maybe, and that's always the problem with Plato, or the challenge with Plato. I wouldn't say problem; it's a challenge that there's many, maybe not definitive conclusions when we prefer definitive conclusions. But at 168a. The statement is made, but we are saying, it seems, that there is a science of this sort, which is a science of no branch of learning, but is a science of itself and the other sciences. And I just wondered if we have any sort of practical reference point for such a science. So is this idea of this science of self, temperance, is a science that encompasses all other sciences, but it is not science. It's not a particular branch of science itself. So you can't say that temperance is physics. You can't say it's chemistry. You can't say it's mathematics, because that's all involves specific knowledge. So knowledge is always of something, right? I think Plato makes that point. Knowledge is always of something. And so how can you have knowledge of knowledge, right? Is that maybe what I was talking about earlier, this kind of infinitely recursive idea, knowledge of knowledge, when we're not talking about knowledge of specific things like of physics, or the numbers of protons and neutrons in iron that causes a supernova to explode the instant it's forged, right? We have knowledge of that fact. Do we know why? And so it's maybe that question of why is that kind of maybe more infinite type of recursive knowledge that never ends. So I just wanted to throw that thought out in that particular passage at 168a, that question, is there a science of other sciences which is not of the particular things that those other sciences deal with, but of the other sciences as a whole? We'll go to Moshe.
Okay, let's take the question and make it a little bit more finite. Suppose we had 100 sciences. That's all. Okay, we found out after exhaustive examination we had 100 sciences. Okay, and so then 99 of those sciences would be sciences about something, and the 100th science would be the science of all those other sciences. So that you would say that the 100th science would know that there was a science of biology, and that there was a science of physics, and there was a science of psychology, and a science of sociology, and a science of mathematics, but it would be a science of nothing. And I took Plato's point to be that a science always has to be about something. And so the question then becomes, is the subject of in our universe where there are 99 independent sciences about something, is that a thing that can be known in and of itself? Okay, can you actually have a science that does nothing but know what the other sciences does? It sounds like, we could be setting up some sort of paradox here. I'm not going to go down that line, but I'm sure that there's one snaking in the wings there. But if you had this science that simply knew all the other sciences, what's the point? I mean, who cares? I mean, if we go back to Donald's point that science, science is about, we have science of the body, we have medicine, and that it's normative. Let's say that you had a physics that could be so complete that it would be normative, and we would be able to make predictions about what stars, not only have knowledge of the stars that have exploded in the past, and that we have knowledge of those past things, but we could also predict accurately, explosions that hadn't even occurred. Okay, and we don't do anything else with this science except know things with it, right? Is that would having a science of all those sciences, including knowing that other sciences are normative in some way, be of value to anybody? And I just can't see how it would be. I mean, who would want to pursue that kind of thing? I just don't. Even the silliest philosophers, I don't think would. That's like the philosophy of shoe steps on the ceiling. You're just not going to. Nobody's going to do that. No one's going to take it seriously.
I like the question, and I like the way you started. Let's make it finite. In the example that you provided of 100 sciences, 99 of them being specific, and the 100th being what I'm thinking of as a mathematical derivative of the other 99, and so. The math and the geometry in my head starts to go because, as I've explained to the group before, I came to Plato by way of geometry, and I think that's fundamentally important. And so when I'm thinking of derivatives and of calculus reduces the infinite to the finite limits. And there's maybe something to be had in that. But this idea that the 100th piece of science in what you mentioned could be a derivative, I think might be something worth exploring. We can do that in a subsequent session. There is actually a transcendental idea that's presented in the Phaedrus, which we'll discuss in our next session. And that's where I see a very clear connection to the base of the natural logarithm. So, this idea of transcendental functions as well is important. We have just time for 2 more comments. So we've got JK and Jane, and then I think we'll have to wrap up today's discussion, unfortunately, but it's been such a great discussion. So thank you all, and we'll go to JK and then Jane. JK?
Yeah, it's really interesting that Plato, raised a question about the whole idea of science as a kind of like a particularization or specialty, of inquiry that takes the particular study of particular area of knowledge and breaks away from a more a holistic view. And that's the difference between philosophy and science, basically, right? Because today we don't think of, a lot of scientists don't see the relevance of philosophy. There's been a whole movement of anti-philosophy in the 20th century. Because we're, science, the different fields of areas of science has broken off from philosophy, and think that there's where the knowledge lies, and there's it ends. And but it's philosophy that wants to bring them all together and understand what is true knowledge, what is self-understanding, what is the understanding of the whole, the self, and so if you're a scientist, of course, Stephen Hawking and the scientists today believe that they have a they have their area of inquiry, and they're sticking to it without any consideration of the philosophical inquiry that philosophy is concerned with. And basically, I'm really impressed that Plato asked that question that far back in the beginning, where the scientists go in these different branches, but they don't care about viewing the tree as a whole and its roots and so forth. So they're not concerned about what the fundamental questions are of ontology, metaphysics, and axiology and so forth, and all the areas of of philosophy.
Thanks. And you mentioned the particular, and then I'm thinking of the progression from the particular to the general. And so if a particular science is of a specified discrete area of knowledge, how do we move from particular knowledge to general knowledge? And that image of the tree again that you mentioned at the end there, JK, reminds me of the comment that was made earlier about the banyan tree. So is there one tree with one root from which all knowledge branches out, or is there a banyan tree of knowledge where the tree keeps putting down new roots? And do those new roots tie to the initial root? It's interesting thought. So I'll leave my speaking at that point to let Jane have the last word, and then we'll let Eva wrap it up. So Jane.
Just a quick remark about what Moshe said. This is not how I see it, but this is an idea that I've come across, and I think it's an interesting idea to explore, about having 99 sciences and then one science that sort of would explain why of the rest of the sciences. I've seen this idea where those 99 sciences are sort of like pieces of a puzzle, and each puzzle piece has a lot of function or utility or a lot of use. But the thing is, if you are able to put the puzzle pieces together, you get a whole picture that would, well, theoretically, fundamentally change the way that we perceive the world, and each of the puzzle pieces is separate. So yeah, just sharing that idea that I came across.
That's a great idea, Jane. And who is going to put the puzzle together? So maybe that's us in dialogue. I love that puzzle analogy. Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for participating in today's discussion. I learned so much. And again, I think that's the benefit of dialogue, and why maybe it was Plato who compelled us to be here. So maybe we'll continue to explore that question of why we are doing what we're doing.
Yes, thank you.
As we continue next time with our discussion on the Phaedrus. So we'll start with the first part of the Phaedrus, and I'll post the point that we'll stop at. It's a long dialogue, so we can't tackle it all in one session, but we'll spread it out among 2 sessions. So looking forward to that in 2 weeks, and I'll pass it over to Eva to wrap up today's episode.
Thank you for joining today's live discussion and class, friends. This was Plato's Pod with James Myers. Always exciting to hear various perspectives of the knowledge and what you're seeking. We believe that would make Plato, Platon happy and proud too. So if you would like to join the live discussion, you can find us online at Toronto Philosophy Meetup, Calgary Philosophy Meetup, Online Rebels Meetup. I am Eva Ellis. It was my pleasure to coordinate this meeting. See you and hear you at another episode. Bye.